We've heard your views on so many things related to the pandemic and with so much clarity, especially with what I've always liked is that you've said that we don't know, or where what we don't know is always clear in all our many conversations and everything online as well. So today what I want to talk about is it's been almost a year since the first vaccines came out and a year since you wrote your book, till we win India's fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to ask you, there are so many things about government policies and other things that there have been enough discussions on. But what have we in India done in terms of science, research, and contributions to the public good when it comes to the pandemic? Have we done enough?
So thanks, Pavan. I think that's a smart question, and it has an answer that's multiple components. Have we done good in the world? Yes, we have done good in the world. We are going to continue to do good in the world because we are going to be providing to the world more and more vaccines over time. And those are significant contributions. It doesn't matter which the vaccine necessarily is. That to me, in many senses, if we look at the vaccines that we are making and we are delivering, that's technology, and that's not so much science. So if we think about what's happening with science and vaccines being developed in India, one of the best examples of science of vaccines related to COVID-19 in India is actually at the Indian Institute of Science here. And that's the work that Raghavan Vardarajan is doing, trying to design protein vaccines. And I think when we are in a situation where when we see vaccines, we hear all the success stories. We hear about all the facilitation that has happened, the partnerships that happened that made these vaccines come out as quickly as they did. What we don't hear about are the failures and the reasons why those failures happen and what we need to learn from those failures in order to facilitate science for the future. So, Raghavan's a very smart protein chemist and has been working on protein structures for HIV, now for SARS-CoV-2. And he did a project where he designed a vaccine that looks very much like the vaccine that Biological E is currently making. Now, Biological E's vaccine, which is a protein vaccine based on the receptor binding domain, is in a collaboration with the Baylor College of Medicine. It's not with what's happening with Raghavan here. What advantage does Baylor have over IISc? Baylor has a critical mass. Baylor has facilities that allow for technology transfers to happen, that allow for assays to be developed, for preclinical validation to happen at scale and with speed that is not necessarily available in India. And here we are talking about best science. Now, if you look at what has happened, every science funding agency in India has invested in science for the COVID pandemic and specifically for vaccines. There have been calls from the Biotechnology Industry Research Assistance Council, from the Department of Biotechnology, Department of Science and Technology, Indian Council of Medical Research, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Everyone claims they are funding vaccine science. What's the average size of a grant? 30 lakhs. What are you going to do with 30 lakhs to develop a vaccine? You can't, spell V of vaccine with that. Animal models are expensive, biologics are expensive, growing up the virus. You need teams, you need critical mass, you need different kinds of expertise if you really want to do both science and product development. So we've developed what I call, borrowing from someone much smarter than me, the spray and pray approach. We'll sprinkle a little bit of money around lots and lots of institutions and we expect magic to happen. It's not going to happen. If you get lucky, it really is magic then, but it doesn't happen very often. So what we've done well has been really technology from companies that had experience with doing this in the past. Whether it is Serum Institute or Bharat Biotech or Biological E or any of the companies that are making vaccines, Zydus Cadila, everybody built on either existing platforms or relationships that they developed with the West. Serum Institute went after Covishield, which is University of Oxford AstraZeneca. Bharat Biotech is working with lots of foreign companies for the nasal vaccine that we hear about in the press. The indigenous technology that they used, I will just leave you with the fact that Novavax's vaccine got approved yesterday. It does not have by WHO. It does not have regulatory approval outside of Indonesia. Bharat Biotech's vaccine took how many months to get approval from WHO? So I think we need to understand that cutting, creating pathways, there needs to be a lot of data behind the vaccine. And making sure that all of the data is there with quality is something that becomes absolutely essential. Novavax is struggling to manufacture in the US, but in terms of serums, chemistry manufacturing controls data, or Novavax's clinical data, obviously WHO didn't have a doubt about those. So there's a lot of takeaways. Basic takeaway is we haven't done well on science, we've done very well on technology.
So maybe with the same theme, I do want to talk about this a little further. Let's take something like clinical research. We have fantastic hospitals, CMC Vellore being one of them in the country. We have the ability to deal with our hospital systems, to deal with thousands upon thousands of patients, and the kind of access to patient diversity in India perhaps is very different from that available in many countries. I mean, this is the reason why if you're a medical student studying in a government medical college, sometimes people say that just the access to our government hospitals, the diversity of patients is an amazing thing. So having said that, when it comes to clinical research on COVID-19, have we still used received wisdom of what has been found elsewhere on how to come up with better strategies to help people, or has there been good work that's happened in India as well?
Okay, so I'm going to sound like a wet blanket for everything here. But, we create you're absolutely right. Our government colleges, our better medical colleges create absolutely amazing doctors because those amazing doctors learn from the patients that they treat. And the more patients you treat, the more you learn about the variations of a disease and how better to handle it. So we create our medical training in government institutions and some of the better private institutions is phenomenal. You will not get that in a Western medical school. The clinical experience you won't get. You may get better theoretical knowledge. But we create our doctors to be doctors, to treat patients, to treat them well, to handle numbers, to handle the diseases that they see. We don't create our doctors to develop the treatments of tomorrow. Very few medical institutions, we have no consideration of academic medicine. What is it that we need to do to make things better for tomorrow? What new treatments can be developed? What new strategies are possible to do? I'll take an example. Drug dosages. Would a 50-kilo Indian woman need the same drug dosage as an 80-kilo American man? Doesn't make sense when you think about it like that. But yet we take all our lessons for how to treat on what has been developed in other parts of the world. The experiences when it comes to infectious diseases, obviously it doesn't make sense for us to borrow from the West because their experience is completely different from ours. But this is what we do. This is what we have traditionally done. We have trained excellent doctors. We have not created academic medical institutions. Because if you were an academic medical institution, you would be an institution that would focus on the academics as much as on the medical. And we don't do that. What happens when we try to do research? Most of the research that's done in India is company sponsored. Companies come to you with a protocol saying, you look after patients of this type. I want you to recruit these many patients that fulfill these inclusion criteria. Here are the forms, fill them in. We'll come and monitor to see that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. That sponsored research is what constitutes research in most academic, or not academic, most large medical institutions that see a lot of patients. And that does not lead to doctors asking questions. What can I do better for my patients? What can I do better for my population? Can I design the study? Can I do the study myself? What are the methods I should be using? Clinical trials, for example, the number of investigator-initiated clinical trials in this country is abysmal, so much to the point where if you want to do a clinical trial that is regulatory for some reason, you want a labeling change or you want to import a drug to try on your patients, you couldn't do it. I was vice principal of research at CMC, and people would want to say, we need DCGI permission for this. We would write off to DCGI and the letters would disappear. So you never got to do regulatory clinical research. Things have changed a little bit. And also, I now know more people I can call up and ask whether they are actually following my file around. So occasionally we do get to do a regulatory clinical trial, but this is not the way things should be. We have enough medical schools, we have enough doctors, we certainly have enough patients with enough problems for whom we know we can do a better job. But that requires for people to be willing to be guinea pigs, for doctors being willing to make their patients into guinea pigs without what is called therapeutic misconception. If I'm the doctor who is treating you, your expectation of me is that I am doing the best I can for you. If I put you into a trial, it has been studied, you will know that you are in the intervention arm and not the control arm. That's not how research works. So training people in how to participate in clinical trials, to not have concepts that are inaccurate, is very important. It's also important for doctors to understand that you are not God. You know, you cannot make decisions for patients when you do clinical trials. You have to separate that from your medical function to a research function. We don't have these concepts in most of the medical colleges that we have. It's an issue.
And we were speaking about this before our session as well. So now you are, you're involved with a clinical trial to test boosters in the country, one that's now in the US, I mean, there's accusations of vaccine hoarding, not particularly happy with that word, but the idea of, a third shot with, we don't know how much added benefit, but now there's a trial happening, I think, with Covaxin. And by the way, people in the room, even in Bangalore, I believe you're recruiting.
Double Covaxin, please come up and let me know.
To see if a booster from Covaxin or something else can help. So can you tell us about the journey of how this one trial has come about? Okay. Ideally, this should have happened the moment the first booster news happened in the West, right? I mean, the moment we had at least people who had taken 2 doses in a couple of months was over, we should have deployed something like this to see how well are our vaccines working.
Okay. So one of the things that's important to remember is that usually vaccines have a much slower development pathway. You know, before this, the fastest vaccine ever made was made in 4 years. And one of the reasons for that is your first phase of vaccines is for safety, your second phase is for immunogenicity, but your second phase is where you play around. You play around with dose, you play around with schedule, you play around with the number of doses and figure out what works best. Now, in this case, we were in a hurry to get to phase 3, which is where you show the vaccine actually works. So that's why we combined either phase 1 and 2, or we combined phase 2 and 3, and we moved rapidly through vaccine development. And last year in November, we showed mRNA vaccines work. Then we showed that, viral vectored vaccines work. Was the formulation that we landed on, the schedule that we landed on, the best one? Pfizer had a 3-week gap, Moderna had a 4-week gap, AstraZeneca had a 4-week gap, but the government decided, or in the UK decided to make it longer. Which one was right? And we had all of this discussed. So would 3 doses initially have been better than 2? What should we have done? We didn't do all those trials during development. So what we are dealing with now, what we should have done as soon as you had vaccines approved for EUA, is now begin to think of, now that we know that the vaccines work, how do we make them work best for individuals and for populations? And that requires clinical trials. So in January of this year, we started to discuss what's the list of studies that needs to be done in order to make sure that whatever vaccines we have work as well as possible. And
So
one
this is
of
January. So this is just 2
January
months
of
after.
2021. Yeah.
So just 2 months after the first vaccine emergency approvals were given in the West.
Yeah. So everybody was discussing in the vaccine community. Everybody knew that, we'd gotten to vaccines working, but there was still a lot more to be done. We were discussing, how do you measure impact? What kinds of studies? What kinds of locations? How will you get vaccines? Should you vary schedules? What kinds of studies are needed? Can you go into children? And then the big thing about this mixing and matching of doses, one thing that's really important to remember is that no vaccine company is going to do those studies. Vaccine companies want you to buy their vaccine, not their vaccine and somebody else's vaccine. So for governments to do the changing of schedules, for governments to do these mixing and matching approaches becomes important. And remember, mixing and matching is not new. When the rotavirus program was rolled out in the country, we had some states that got Bharat Biotech's vaccine, and we had other states that got Serum Institute's vaccine. Then we realized that children migrate. So they migrate from a state that has one vaccine to a state that has another vaccine. Can you mix the vaccine doses, or do you leave the child unimmunized? So in fact, these studies of mixing vaccines for programmatic purposes have been done in India before. So what we needed to do, and we said at that time, is we don't know what supply is going to be like. We don't know which place is going to get how much of which vaccine. So what are the combinations that we can do? So this discussion started in January. By probably about May, June, I realized that nobody had any interest in doing these studies. So then we went around asking people interested in doing the study and funding the study. And the study that we got approved by DCGI in a remarkably short period of time. So all kudos to DCGI for approving that study. It was approved in August. We started in September. We finished the Covishield arm really quickly. We are still recruiting for Covaxin, but that's because only about 11% of the country's gotten Covaxin. But the idea there is to say, if you had 2 doses of Covishield or 2 doses of Covaxin and you get the other vaccine, then what does that mean for boosters? We also have a second study included in that, which is a heterologous priming study. So you mix the initial 2 doses. That study is also recruiting, but I'm assuming everybody in this room is already vaccinated, so I'm not asking for volunteers.
So it often feels like, again, there are so many gaps. There is still, sometimes we say that every crisis is an opportunity. If we go back to Sanskrit, there's the phrase Yuddha Kale Shastrabhyasa, but that's almost sometimes seen as a positive, whereas actually in the original connotation, it means that you're trying to learn how to use weapons while a war is on. And that's, first of all, that's not ideal. Second, it feels like with wave after wave and with Omicron, and I don't know what's going to happen with that around the corner. I don't know if you're learning the lessons from the past. What's your experience, both whether in the medical fraternity, in the science fraternity, or in government? Are we learning things from the past, or are we trying to do the same as before?
I think scientists are learning very quickly. So each time there is a new variant that comes up, a new situation that is introduced, you can see that the scientists are quicker off the mark in terms of all the things that need to be done. I mean, INSACOG was established as a response to Alpha. It went very slowly on Delta, but subsequent to that, it has been doing reasonably. Still lots of issues to be ironed out, but we are sequencing hundreds of times more than we did this time last year. And we have to recognize that these are achievements. You can't build them all to be perfect overnight, but the trajectory is in the right direction. So I do think that scientists are learning. Policymakers tend to be slower to learn. I'll leave it at that.
I also want to ask, do you see, because of whatever developments have happened, I mean, we've talked about the pace of vaccine development here, but also with rapid testing, with RT-PCR testing becoming common, right? And that's something where there's a heavy capital investment required to have these machines across the country, but now they exist. And so I want to ask, if do you see potential for us to be able to answer better questions, not just about COVID-19, but about all the millions of other infectious diseases that run rampant across India, right? Like, for example, dengue has 4 strains and they're not all the same virus. Can we actually tell when somebody, I think the government also has fairly strict rules on who gets classified as a dengue patient, right? Otherwise, you have a dengue-like fever. If a private lab diagnoses you, you get treated, you get rest and you recover, but you don't go into the official records. So do you think there's a potential now for the future where, be it in diagnostics, be it in disease tracking, surveillance, everything, that we can do better on things beyond COVID-19?
No question. And one of the reasons that diagnostics was difficult earlier was because you had to use a different method for every bug. So bacteria have to grow in culture. For viruses, you can do culture or ELISA or PCR. Parasites require you to look for them under the microscope. So it was very challenging. For each bug, you had to have a different strategy. What molecular diagnostics like RT-PCR gives you is the opportunity to do syndromic diagnostic. I have a fever. Can this test actually look at the top 5 causes of fever and give me a result? I have a cough. If I give a nasal swab, can I get top 5 causes of respiratory infections, diarrhea, central nervous system infections, urinary tract infections? When you take a molecular approach, you can then say, this is my panel and I'm going to look for it. Now, in some situations, it can be challenging. For example, typhoid by PCR is terrible because there's only 1 bacterium per ml of blood. So that can be hard to find. But otherwise, things like dengue and others can be picked up very easily on PCR. So it is possible to develop panels for PCR, for syndromic diagnosis. And if we do it at scale, we can really make it really, really cheap. You could even think about a tiered surveillance system where some districts become districts where surveillance is done at a high level, or certain situations, you have an outbreak and you go in there and you don't look for one bug, you look for all the common bugs. And if you don't find them, then you have a referral laboratory to which you can send samples. So building up surveillance, the RT-PCR infrastructure does offer us a much greater opportunity.
And surveillance here is a much better word than when we use surveillance in other contexts, right?
True.
Because I mean, the moment surveillance comes again, we are now talking about privacy. And one of your recent op-eds also, you wrote about how we don't have actually linkages between any of our data, which again is challenging from a privacy point of view, but essential from a public health point of view, right? If we are not able to track who's got how many doses of vaccines, what is the severity of disease, whether they needed to go to the hospital, and what was the outcome, we can't actually quite tell how well things are working in the country, right?
Yeah. So I think for infectious diseases, one of the things that you always worry about is stigmatization. And we've seen that with HIV, we've seen it with TB, we saw it in the early stages of this pandemic where doctors who were treating COVID patients weren't allowed to come back home. And I think part of that is that we don't do a good job of communication. But when we think about surveillance and surveillance systems and electronic records that allow you to link across different kinds of data, for public health, that is considered absolutely essential. So I'll talk about data and how it's usually reported. There are two ways, basic ways of reporting data. One is data that is called case-based data. So you can track everything down to the level of the individual. This is their test, this is what happened to them. And if you have a unique identifier that links across all databases, it's not very hard to do. You can de-identify in a variety of ways. But what we've traditionally done is, because we've created these silos, what we wind up with is aggregate data from each silo. So many cases, so many deaths, so many hospitalizations. Was the case hospitalized and died? You can't tell. But you can say this is the total number of what we saw. And that's the problem, really, that we've gone so far with aggregated data. And to some extent, I'll blame WHO and the many WHO people who taught us how to do surveillance, that they were willing to accept aggregate reports from certain settings. They are also now moving to case-based data. And quite frankly, I think that's the only way to make sense of what you're seeing in a country as large as India.
So I do want to keep some space for questions as well, but I want to ask you, like, I mean, there is no end to us talking about all the various failings in the public health system in the country and how we've, again, struggled to learn the right lessons even over the course of the last 18 to 24 months. But what do you gives hope? Right? I mean, you've been working as a science communicator, as a researcher, and working in science. So, what gives you hope during the course of this pandemic in India?
Some states are doing a phenomenal job. They are building the right kinds of linkages, infrastructure, information systems, and they're really able to get snapshots of where things are a problem and then bring interventions to those areas. There are always gaps. There are always things that can be done better, but particularly in the South, there is a commitment to do better, and states have in general upped their game. So that's, I think, good to see from the government. It's gone well, and I hope that they really stay with this. And I think from some of the discussions that we've had with government officials, they recognize that they have done better. Ultimately, it's a kind of positive feedback loop. If people tell you you're doing a good job, you recognize you're doing a good job, you want to do that much better. So I hope we stay with that. The second that I thought was interesting was about society and how much more of an interest there is in public health, in learning about disease and about what's happening in you and around you. Sometimes it goes a little bit overboard. And I think that's because we don't always have credible sources of information. So one of the reasons I try very hard to do science communication is, at least if I can tell you, this much we know and this much we don't know, I find that people are more comfortable when you're able to spell out what's really unknown, what we are still learning about, what we might learn about in the future. And if we make mistakes, to admit that our framing was not correct 6 months or a year ago. The other thing in the second wave was the way, actually in the first wave, the way volunteers got together in order to gather data and try and make sense of it. In the second wave, the way volunteers got together to help other people. I think that was just phenomenal. I think ultimately there is an element of altruism in most everybody. You have to give it the opportunity. We have not been a volunteering culture, but there is no reason why we can't be.
And I do want to say that here I might be a bit of a wet blanket, but I really do see and I really appreciate the increased interest in science and in public health that we've seen. But I fear that so much of that is also limited to an English speaking audience, right? Because so much more of we are having this conversation in English. I know that you also do what you can in Hindi, but I feel that so much more of what happens in our languages is in the form of public service announcements, do's, don'ts, wear a mask, get your vaccine, this will be fine, this is 100% safe, and does not have the nuance that is needed for people to actually develop trust and interest.
That's
Right.
your maa baap sarkar.
On that perhaps questionable note, I do want to throw it up for questions.
From what I've read across like the internet and like media, it's that a lot of scientific research is very gendered in that they take your male bodies as your standard sample. And one of the ways it showed up in the pandemic was how there were reports of, and I mean, I experienced it personally too, on how vaccines affected menstrual cycles in menstruating persons. So, and there were a lot of reports, there was a lot of reporting across countries on how they affected like menstruating persons. And there were no responses, at least that I could track from official bodies or vaccine manufacturers for that matter. So, like, how do you see this gendered scientific research not being gendered anymore?
No, so, with menstruation, one of the questions I asked is, if you have women who take vaccines at different points in their menstrual cycle, is your immune response different? Are your side effects different? And I tried to persuade people that this was a study that really needed to be done. I got close, but couldn't get anyone to fund doing a study like that. But most often people don't even think about things like this. And if there aren't more women in the scientific community talking about these issues, it's never going to happen.
Yeah, which was like sort of my follow-up on, do you see a hopeful future for like better scientific research, at least within the Indian community? I mean, I know that there are already issues of like lacking scientific research, but do you somehow see that there can be steps that can be taken to sort of like deal with these structural issues that already exist?
So I think it took me 20 years to find a voice. And I'm hoping that with the young women that I'm seeing today who are articulate, much more confident than I ever was, that gap will be shorter. I don't think it will disappear entirely in a generation, but I hope that women begin to engage and speak up about the things that matter to us much faster than I did.
Oh, thank you. That's all I have.
Hello, ma'am. First of all, thank you so much for your service. My question is slightly technical. You spoke a lot about how clinical trials are not happening because we have built institutions that are institutions of healthcare delivery, but not institutions of medical research excellence. I'm in the health tech space, and so one of the theses that I had was that we simply do not have enough data to be able to run, some of these trials that are required. So even centers of excellence like CMC or AIIMS are not at the same level of, do not have the same amount or level of data as say at Johns Hopkins. Do you think that NDHM coming in is going to change this and actually help transform India into from just a healthcare delivery nation to having institutions that can actually engage in healthcare, in meaningful healthcare research?
NDHM is
In
voluntary.
the National
for,
Digital
no,
Health
no,
Mission.
it's voluntary for private organizations.
Yes,
So whether the CMCs of the world will participate or not, we don't know yet. CMC actually has had electronic health records for
Decades.
close on 20 years.
Yeah.
And we've finally gotten to a stage because it requires for even doctors and the community we work in to be comfortable with the idea of electronic searching of records across disciplines. We've gotten to that stage now, and I'm hopeful that that is what will happen in the future. With the NDHM, it is an excellent idea in principle. It'll all depend on the execution. And the problem in India with clinical research, with academic institutions, with medical records in general, is the level of completion and the level of accuracy are very low.
Yeah.
So unless we focus on data quality and data standards, NDHM as an avenue to research will remain limited.
Noted, ma'am. Thank you.
But I'm in arts and history. I'm a researcher and working on as an activist in the ecological science. There is one tree which gives food after 66 years. Extracting that particular tree food as a food protein dosage for pneumonia, only 3 spoonfuls of in form of cereal cured. I was searching for that particular medicine, and people used to cut down that particular tree. It is red listed already in the world. So I'm struggling to safeguard that endangered species. I want, after investing it my own pocket money, I invested some 25,000 rupees to extract that sap and food. I got it, and I gave to my barefoot doctor because I'm having a very good, okay. And how I can have access with the government research, because it cures the jaundice, it cures the pneumonia. Okay, but we get only that after 66 years in particular tree. That tree is how I can go for research.
There is actually in Bangalore the Transdisciplinary University, and they are the ones that look at natural and traditional medicines, and they do the early work on these treatments. So you might want to get in touch with them.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gagandeep Kang and Mr. Pawan. Thank you so much for this.